Cecilia, we're ready when you are.
Yes, you're online. On behalf of America's Society and Council of the Americas, I want to welcome everyone to our virtual space to what promises to be a lively debate today. My name is Cecilia Tornaghi. I'm managing editor for America's Quarterly publication about Latin America. And I am honored to be your host today and moderating this panel with amazing guests. And it's a timely debate. The pandemic did lay bare our vulnerabilities around in Latin America, nothing that we didn't know about, but we showed our gaps became open wounds all of a sudden, institutionally, socially, economic challenges, all of them showed up. And the role of multilaterals in all of this will be our discussions today, how they can help us get out of the hole. Our region is facing its largest recession on record. 9.4% is the IMF's projection for the region. It is the worst in the globe as well. And not to mention the awful lead we are right now on deaths and the spread of the new coronavirus, ballooning deficits. So there is a lot. We will need all of the help of bright minds and money that we can get across the region. So it brings us to our question today. How will the organizations and the multilateral organizations be able, IDB, IMF, OAS, be able to help us crawl back and help Latin America emerge back from the wreckage of COVID-19? To help us today, we have not only bright minds, incredible minds, but also incredibly experienced and hands-on into the subjects in these institutions. We have with us Otaviano Canuto, who's principal of the Center for Macroeconomics and Development, but former VP at the World Bank and several other leading posts at the IMF, IDB, and as well as representing Brazil in a number of institutions. So great to have you here. A resume that is, all of you has a resume that's longer than we have for the introduction, so let me cut it short. Nancy Lee, Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Global Development, who also led the Multilateral Investment Fund at the IDB, which is a key impact investor in the region, as well as roles at U.S. Treasury and deep links to Latin America. And of course, last but not least, Bosco Marti joins us from Mexico right now. He's a former executive director at the IDB for Mexico and the Dominican Republic, just left this post, and had several other posts and experience also at Mexican federal government. So that will be a lively discussion, I know, and all of you watching can and should participate. You can send your questions if you're on the WebEx, and please look for the AQ moderator, and you can send your questions there. But if you are on live stream, Twitter, or YouTube, you can also send your questions. Just send us to us through social media using the hashtag @ASUOA or @AmerQuarterly. For America's Quarterly, and we will get your questions and you'll make sure to bring you in. So without further delay, let's get into the discussion. And of course, to start, besides the role of the institutions in Latin America and helping us get out of the deep hole that we keep digging, that the situation is not letting down yet. But on top of that, we have a controversial election somewhere where we didn't expect, at a development bank, at a multilateral organization. So come September 12th, there will be an online vote scheduled starting on September 11th for the next leader at the IDB. United States surprised everyone, setting up its own candidate. Will be breaking a precedent, a 6-decade precedent of having a Latin American at the helm of the Inter-American Development Bank. Not everyone is on board. There are calls to postpone the election, and some countries already citing their support. So they do need 75% of the quorum for the vote. So the discussion is at this moment that we have all this need and this delicate moment for the region. We also have a discussion around leadership at a major lender for the region and support. So Otaviano, I'd like to start with you. The pandemic continues to rage regardless. How much disruption can this bring to the region, and which one, the postponing it or having an American at the helm?
Yeah, it's true. You actually said, first of all, thank you very much for having me here in such a good company. And the topic is somber, but what I can say is the following. Indeed, as you actually said, Cecilia, the region is currently the epicenter of the COVID dissemination. And it is the region among developing countries the hardest hit in terms of economic growth, and that's terrible. The multilateral institutions within their own mandates, they have clearly ramped up their effort to do their job. We have seen the IMF as the provider of liquidity, last resort, kind of putting the hands on with some countries in the region, countries that were already facing difficulties, either specifically with balance of payments like Ecuador or Argentina, moving on through its debt restructuring process. In this case, there is no ongoing program, but one is expected to happen once Argentina calls for the IMF. The program with Ecuador has worked well. And we also saw something that I would like to highlight, which was the 500 million plus liquidity support from the IMF to Jamaica, associating the support to some flexibilization of fiscal targets in Jamaica. That's really something very much telling about the extraordinary times we're living through. But overall, I would say that some clear change have taken place in the IMF approach to the countries. I was there at the board of the IMF when it became clear the role to be taken into account by debt sustainability concerns in any IMF program. So now, upfront, given the impossibility or the prohibition for the IMF to lend money to countries under unsustainable debt conditions, the call for debt restructuring is now something more accepted as part of the standard too. On the side of multilateral development banks, like the World Bank and the IDB, they also have made an extra effort, this is clear, to speed up processes to not only approve but disburse special projects particularly related to COVID-19. There has been this reshuffle in the portfolios of several countries in order to give space to the support to health measures, but also to support, let's say, the resort to social protection systems, whatever they have been called on. Obviously, one must keep things in reality, that these institutions are no saviors. They are helpers. They can provide support. They can facilitate. It makes things easier for countries, particularly those who are facing difficulties to get finance, given the circumstance where we are living through, particularly immediately after the financial shock in February and March. But they're doing well in this case. We should keep in mind that the tragedy is the regions, but we have very important country-specific features that should be taken into account, and we'll have the chance to delve into some of them along our conversation. So they have made up their role. They are no saviors, but they're good helpers.
And I guess the change of the IDB it's not bothering you right now, the conundrum there. So Nancy, I'll throw it to you then. Do you think that, the IDB is much more than loans and help? We're going to go back into that detail by countries for sure, and the role of ALTS. But it's a curiosity because the IDB has a really large role in the region, much beyond loans. It provides support, technical support, expertise in several areas, data. So it goes on and on. So U.S. leadership right now, would it be like a risk or a bonus? Would it like help it, even raise more funds, or could it be a riskier, having this kind of change at the IDB specifically?
First of all, I'm delighted to be with this excellent group and having this conversation at this critical time, because it's absolutely the case that the multilateral institutions in the region are absolutely in the spotlight, because if they don't play the role that they have to play, the pandemic, the crisis we're in, could really persist for many years and change the growth paths and poverty reduction paths in the region for a long time to come. So let me just pick up on a few points that Otaviano just made, and then I welcome the opportunity to comment on the leadership issue at the IDB. As Otaviano said, this is the worst affected region. It has a number of structural problems that make the macroeconomic problems more difficult to deal with, as well as the health problems. Even though it's a middle income region, the health spending of the region is quite low if you compare it to per capita to advanced countries, to OECD countries. So it's got a lot of challenges in the health sector. It's got the highest degree of informality in its productive sector of any region in the world, which makes it hard for governments to reach the most vulnerable with social protection programs and programs to support firms. And it also is lagging in e-government, in digitalization of government services, which is a bad thing at a time when you want to be able to reach households and firms remotely, precisely because of the pandemic. So you want to be able to get social transfers and firm support through digitized delivery systems like mobile services, as opposed to having to do these things in person. So this all complicates a set of issues. So to pick up on Otaviano's point, the international financial institutions have to come forward. The IMF, the World Bank, the IDB, CAF, all of the international financial institutions. My colleague at the Center for Global Development, Liliana Rojas Suarez, and her fellow members of the Committee on Latin American Financial Issues estimate that the international financial institutions are going to have to supply something like 200 to 300 billion if stimulus and social payments totaling something like 10% of GDP are to be made available to the region. That the 10% is much larger than that, but that's the share of the international financial institutions. And most of that will have to come from the IMF, because after all, the IDB and CAF and the World Bank lend, something like 12 billion or less each to the region. The IMF has an excellent tool for just these circumstances, which is called an Sdr allocation. It's an allocation of liquidity for all its members. It would be particularly useful for emerging markets because they would get a substantial share, and those emerging markets are in Latin America. So I think pressing forward with that, even though there's resistance on the part of the United States and perhaps others, is a really important thing to do. But as Otaviano said, the other issue is fiscal conditionality. We're in a totally different world than the usual IMF, World Bank, IDB budget lending conditionality world, where the idea is to compress spending in order to get to debt sustainability as quickly as possible. And we know that debt is rising rapidly in many countries in the region. In this case, spending has to increase if there's to be enough growth to ever get back to debt sustainability. And so the issue becomes not to compress spending, but to target it effectively to the most vulnerable households and businesses. So that's a very different role for those institutions. And I suspect they are now scrambling to try to change their thinking and their analysis on what kinds of fiscal conditions are right. The private finance arms of these institutions, the multilateral development banks, are going to be critical. We can come back to that. They need to be counter-cyclical. In the global financial crisis, they were not counter-cyclical, at least the IDB Invest, which was then IIC, and IFC was pro-cyclical. In other words, they retreated at the same time as the private banks. And then I think, and we can have more conversation on this as well, there will need to be a conversation about the capital adequacy of these institutions. Do the multilateral development banks have enough capital going forward? On the subject of leadership, I think the place to start, and I'm now going to speak really in terms of U.S. interests in these institutions. So to me, the place to start is what makes these institutions, and particularly the IDB, a huge asset for the United States. And I think the first issue, which I think sometimes gets forgotten, is that it's an excellent financial deal for the United States. The amount of capital that the United States has to contribute when there is a capital increase is extremely small in relation to the additional capital that other countries put in, but also in terms of the additional lending that's made possible by capital increases. So in the last capital increase, the United States had to put in $500 million total over 5 years, and lending doubled from something like $6 billion to $12 billion a year. So it's a great deal. Number two, the institution is a driver of policy reform and institution building in the region in a way that the United States as a bilateral force cannot really duplicate. The multilateral institutions provide this sort of degree of political separation that's critical in driving policy reform. And finally, it's a huge knowledge hub. And I have to also give a shout out to my former home at the IDB, the Multilateral Investment Fund, now the IDB Lab, which to me is a unique asset that the IDB has. So in order to extract returns from that asset, the region has to invest in the institution, its credibility, legitimacy, ownership, and trust. And two critical things which underpin that for the IDB is the fact that the borrowing countries in the region have half of the shares. That's not universally the case. So it's more like a credit cooperative, as Nancy Birdsall, one of my colleagues, is wont to say. And number two, the president is chosen from among the borrowing countries of the region. So the president is a political leader or a finance leader that's dealt with the same kinds of problems as the borrowing countries have, and therefore understands the kinds of solutions that would make a difference. So I think it's a very false logic to say that the U.S. interest is installing a U.S. national as president of the institution. In my mind, that reduces the credibility of the institution for the borrowing countries of the region, which is exactly against the U.S. interest in preserving that kind of credibility and legitimacy. So I would say, not just from the borrowing countries of the region and from the institution's perspective, but from the perspective of the U.S. interest itself, it's not the right move, and the president should be chosen from among the borrowing countries.
That return on investment that you just mentioned is like it unraveled anyway. Bosco, I want to come to you still on that. We're going to go into more details, but it's just that there is a push from many countries to postpone that due to that, and where do you lay that it's in everybody's interest and having the knowledge and all that. But the push came with support from Chile, from Argentina, and then even Mexico came in support of actually the calls for postponing, which a little bit of a surprise there as well. Do you see that gaining traction, and is Mexico's position, it was getting closer to the U.S. on that, and how do you see the leadership at the IDB?
Thank you very much, Cecilia. I think that it's first of all, I want to thank the Council of the Americas for this great invitation, and I feel very honored to be next to Otaviano and Nancy Lee, with whom I've been working for at least the past 10 years. So I feel very flattered to be part of this group, and I also hope that everybody's families are safe and in good health in these complicated times of pandemics. I agree on almost everything that has been said by Otaviano and by Nancy, about the key role that these institutions have to play. In the case of the IDB, it's one of the main lenders for many of the countries in Latin America. It's not the case for Mexico, but for many of the smaller countries, it's basically one of their only sources of finance, given that they don't have access. Some of them don't have a good access to capital markets. These are institutions. In the case of the bank, that was created 60 years ago, and that certainly needs some actualization and refurbishing to make sure it's up to date on the challenges that the region is facing right now. We still need to work, obviously, in reducing poverty and inequality, but we need to do it with sustainability, development that is both social inclusive and environmental sustainable. This is why the bank has been working to update the integrated policy framework, to manage environment and social risks. And as both Otaviano and Nancy mentioned, there's a key need to work with the private sector. I was looking at the tweet of Secretary Arturo Herrera this morning, and he gave a very interesting figure. In the case of Mexico, the private sector invests almost seven times more than the public sector. So there's a great need, for these institutions to work much closer with the private sector, and also greater collaboration amongst themselves. On regards to the election, IDB is passing through a very interesting moment. The annual meeting that was supposed to take place this year in March in Barranquilla, Colombia, had to be postponed because of the pandemic. And last year we were also going to have our annual meeting in China that was canceled at the last moment, and then we had a much smaller version of this meeting in Ecuador. So I understand the positions of some of the countries that said that there's a need for governors to meet and to get together. As far as the election goes, the board of the IDB decided on July 9th, unanimously with the support of all countries, that the election was going to take place on September 12th and September 13th. And given that it's not going to be possible to do it on presence as we were hoping to do it in Barranquilla, it was also decided that the annual meeting that was going to take place in Barranquilla will take place next year in Colombia. So this is going to be the first time that the bank is going to have a change of leadership with a virtual election. As far as I know, there hasn't been any changes in terms of changing the day of the election. But as you mentioned, the bylaws and the rules for electing a president, they ask that there needs to be quorum in order to have an election, and that quorum requires 3/4 of the vote of the bank. No, I really hope that the countries and the people that have expressed different ideas, no, will be able to come together, no, and come to some sort of agreement, no, because I guess it wouldn't be the best precedent, not to have an assembly that was sabotaged by not giving the quorum. No, so there's still plenty of time from now till September. So I hope that all the parts continue to have close conversations, and as I'm sure they're having, and be able to reach some agreement. No, I think that all of the candidates that are right now being presented have the credentials and the capability of becoming very, very strong and good presidents. No, but I think that the best will be to keep up with the election.
Yeah, and with the bylaws having already set the guidelines and what happens, at least there is no disruption, so to speak, in the operation of the bank, right? So either way, if there is a postponement, that we shouldn't expect disruptions by what you're saying. So let's go back to the issue, because you both mentioned fiscal conditionality, as you said, Nancy, and the changes that Otaviano said. I didn't think I was going to live to hear the IMF talking about, forget austerity. I didn't think I was going to live for that. I'm Brazilian, and that is something that did change. So, of course, the scenario has changed, but the bill will come due. And right now, the order is we have to work, but the bill will come due. So what is it, and what are the priorities, or where should it be going? Nancy, I'll go to you first, because you mentioned about working with the private sector. Is that the way to go, or what should be the constraints be put right now so that this bill is not causing further problems down the road?
Well, as you say, the bill will come due. Debt is rising in the region inevitably this year as fiscal imbalances expand and may reach 70% of GDP, pushing against worrisome levels. I think that's inevitable. I think the middle-income countries and low-income countries have the same need to do a lot more social spending and a lot more support for businesses this year. The alternative to that really is to allow the recession to deepen and to persist, so that there is no real growth-oriented way. There's no way to grow out of this enormous hit that these economies are taking. So it's a situation where it's global. So that's very unusual. It's certainly an exogenous shock. I mean, countries are being hit by something that's really exogenous to their own policy choices. The private sector is retreating, especially in funding small firms in the informal sector. So the public sector has to step up. I think there's no alternative to that. And in addition to that, there's no alternative to a lot more spending from the international financial institutions, because the private sector is not going to be there with large increments to spending, to financing public deficits. So, perhaps I think an unprecedented demand for resources from the international financial institutions. And in the short term, they are going to have to support additional spending by governments rather than cuts in spending. That doesn't mean they should throw caution and accountability and transparency and targeting out of the window. Quite the opposite. It's really important that the spending be done well, but it does mean that the content of the policy conditions of the program is going to change very substantially. And as Otaviano was mentioning, it makes this very difficult with respect to assessing debt sustainability, because you're in a situation where debt is rising, fiscal deficits are rising, but there's no alternative to additional stimulus spending to return to growth. So debt sustainability problems are getting worse. And so you're asking international financial institutions to lend into less and less sustainable situations, which is not something they like to do, especially the IMF. So the IMF, I think, is really going to have to start looking at how it thinks about debt sustainability and how it thinks about debt overhangs and things which prevent recovery. Again, just to mention, though, the IMF has this very powerful tool for boosting liquidity in the region in terms of allocating its currency, its SDRs. It just takes a decision on the part of the Board of Governors, and that liquidity can be made available. There isn't much of an argument that's going to be inflationary in this environment. I think the other counter arguments have to do with policy conditionality, that the SDR allocation would not be conditioned on any particular policy requirements, but in an environment where you just need more liquidity in economies and more liquidity available to governments, I think that there's no better time for an SDR allocation. So I guess what I'm saying is we need a combination of some adjustment in the standard approach of the international financial institutions, but we also need the shareholders to think differently as well in support of those changes.
I was wondering if there was a expanded role for IDB Invest for AFC at the moment that we have jobs, employment plummeting and firms closing left and right, and then at that level as well, if there is an expanded role for them.
And including the IDB Invest, as you mentioned, the private sector.
Yes.
And that's very hard, again, for the private finance arms of these institutions to really substantially boost lending at a time when the private sector is retreating. And that's not what they did in the global financial crisis. They're going to have to adapt as well. Their balance sheets are probably going to be negatively affected. That's going to then present the shareholders with some tough decisions on the capital adequacy of these institutions, both how they use their existing capital as well as whether they're going to need additional capital. And I hope the U.S. takes a leadership role in those discussions as opposed to a backward-leaning kind of foot-dragging role.
Yeah. At Bosco, with that, is it the time then for further collaboration amongst the different multilaterals, and also with the smaller institutions, the regional and local institutions? Is it happening, and is there a role for that? Would that be enough to increase the funds available?
I think that's a key issue, Cecilia, and I totally agree that there's a lot of opportunity to do that. When I was still part of the board of the IDB, together with my Mexican counterpart at the Central American Development Bank, we were able to do the first joint meeting of the board of the Central American Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. And this was a very positive meeting where we were able to see that there are a lot of common projects and issues that we're working for the Central American region, and not necessarily we have the best coordination and collaboration. So thanks to this meeting, there was a follow-up by IDB staff together with CABE staff, and they met and they identified several areas where we can collaborate and work closely. At the end of the day, these institutions are owned by the countries. They are our clients, and we need to find the way we can best serve them. And instead of being competing for the same projects or trying to get the juicy and sexy projects out there, really roll our sleeves and work together to find the best solutions for this country and try to focus in the different areas where we can work best. No, and this is something that needs to be pushed by all levels. No, certainly by the member countries, but also their boards, senior management. No, and at the end of the day, it requires a very close collaboration on the terrain by the country offices that are working there. So I see a lot of room and opportunity to have a deeper and greater collaboration between the development banks to better serve the countries, especially in these times of pandemics. No, I think that the banks in general have done a very good job to help the countries address the emergency challenges during the pandemic. But the hardest part is still to come. No, that is going to be the recovery and really, as Nancy mentioned, trying to be counter-cyclical and help the countries step up the investment they need to do in order to boost the economy and to get things moving again.
We're looking for funds here. I'm digging for funds here, Otaviano. Then the SDR, SDR, as Nancy was mentioned. I mean, and what is the holdup? We got already questions coming online for us also, and the SDR was exactly a question here. And what is the holdup? Why can't and why not go that direction?
Great. I will go to the SDRs, but let me take the chance to highlight something quite important that Nancy mentioned, which is the fact that the relevance of the development banks goes much beyond the flows of funds that they carry on. In my times at the World Bank, I like to call it, and that applies to the IDB and CAF, they are also hummingbirds in the sense that they help pollinize knowledge, learning across the countries. The World Bank, for instance, and the IDB learned a lot from Brazil and Mexico on social programs like the Oportunidades and Bolsa Familia. And they were able thereby to carry those lessons to other countries. And also, as Nancy said, the relevance of what these institutions do is also when they crowd in other flows, when they make possible the joint movement of other, including private capital, particularly when the arrangements are such as to open the space for that. I also want to mention something about the collaboration. With the fragmentation that we have seen in the architecture of multilateral banks, particularly with the emergence of the Chinese banks and NDB and also the growth of CAF, there has always been a fear that they might start some sort of a competition, let's say, undermining standards and so on. I'm a testimony of a case when I was working with the Philippines, where the World Bank was developing a project on flood management for the city of Manila, and using the team of technicians who had worked in Bahia in Brazil, and they went there to do a similar thing from Salvador to Manila. And then suddenly the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank knocked the door and said, "Can I join in?" And it was a triple win for the bank, because the bank had its limitations to put money into the project. The Filipinos were happy because they had more money for that project. And the Chinese were also happy because they could piggyback on a very good project and learn from it. So the scope for collaboration leads to multiple wins, and as long as they are not dominated. Also, a point quite important that one must keep in mind: the COVID-19 is a catastrophe, and in catastrophic situations, the only insurer of last resort is the public sector. That's why all over the world, to different degrees, the public sector is the one who has been calling the shots, including, and there has been some understanding of this, to the point that the risk premium, for instance, have not evolved as some might fear. There's going to be a ramp up of public debt. But let's face it, it was a matter of survival to have the transfers of income to the most affected people, the most vulnerable. And by the way, the reason why IMF, World Bank, and OECD have misforecasted, for instance, the performance of Brazil has been exactly that. They did not take into account, it was hard to do it at that time, the consequences of the transfer of income to the people. In the case of Brazil, you had an emergency aid distributed to 70 million people. And that was in a greater amount than, for instance, the fall in the wage bill in Brazil. And that's why the recovery in Brazil and the forecast of GDP downfall by all institutions have changed since, for instance, June. And it's not a disaster necessarily, as I had the chance to write in a recent piece for America's Quarterly, provided that, let's say, within a certain time horizon, the framework of fiscal responsibility is put back in action, we might have let's say, a postponement of the dates in which the public debt moves towards sustainable levels, but it's not a mayhem necessarily. So that's something that countries should be praised for doing, even if they have debt implications in the short term. In the case of Brazil, the public debt to GDP is going to reach probably something close to 100% of the end of this year. But no one is predicting a disaster, a debt disaster, as long as the ceiling on spending, for instance, is restored next year and so on. Now, back finally to the SDRs. Definitely, there is an idle space to be used by the IMF to boost the available resource, which the accounting money that it creates. And interestingly, of course, in the beginning of the pandemics, there were many calls for a new round of SDR creation, as Nancy aptly recalled. And then comes the resistance from some major part one countries, let's say, in the IMF. But as Kristalina has aptly said, there might be some space for, let's say, transfer using already existing SDRs, in the sense that many countries have SDR allocations that remain idle without use, and some arrangement might be made to allow other countries in need to resort to those reserves with a price, of course. Also, there have been calls for the IMF maybe to replicate and to help extend the kind of swap line agreements that the Federal Reserve Bank has established with some emerging markets, for instance, in order not to have the Federal Reserve going beyond, let's say, its will to do swap line agreements with everybody. Eventually, one might see the development of those swap lines through the IMF. So there is scope for extending the reach of the IMF lines, including the SDRs and other arrangements, keeping always in mind that the IMF provides short-term resource, liquidity, not necessarily, let's say, the full solution, of course, to the issues at hand, the challenge that will come after the pandemics, like the increased public debt in all these countries.
I really admire anyone that's trying to do math right now and calculating GDP projections going forward. I really admire this, crystal ball situation, especially you mentioned Brazil. Now, will the emergency fund, continue or not continue? And then how do you calculate how Brazil will do if it's, if it goes, if it doesn't anyway. So I admire you guys that do this exercise. And you mentioned, I would like to ask about the hummingbird and all the roles there are. Nancy, you mentioned the problem, the spending health being quite low for middle income countries. So where are we missing the hummingbird? Especially we have polarization right now. Political polarization is growing in the region, so collaboration is harder, and nationalism on the rise as well. So does that impact, or can the hummingbird be pollinating right now, especially in the health sector?
Well, there are some advantages that the region has in terms of the government machinery to get to vulnerable households, poor populations. It is, as Otaviano said, it is the region which developed conditional cash transfers, and now there are transfer programs that aren't necessarily conditional, and they're on a very large scale. So in some ways, some countries in the region are better positioned to get funding to households than more advanced countries like the United States, which has to use the records produced by its tax system in order to identify the people to send the stimulus checks to, which doesn't work very well, because of course the poor sometimes don't actually need to pay taxes because they're below limits. So that's the positive. On the positive side, there is machinery. It works especially well, as I was saying before, if you can use online forms of transfers, so you can remotely transfer spending supplements to the poor. So institutions like the IDB have helped countries around the region build their cash transfer programs, and I think that effort is now bearing a lot of fruit. Then I think you have to look at what the region does for firms. And there, I think you have a much more difficult situation, because so much of the firms that produce such a large share of the jobs are in the informal sector. So we're talking about a lot of small firms, even micro firms, that are in the informal sector outside the formal financial system, don't have a relationship with the major banks in the region, and therefore it's very hard to get them credit, or even to give them credit relief in these circumstances. So in my mind, what that means, especially for the private finance arms of these institutions, they may well have to work with some financial partners that they normally would not work with. So I'm talking more about microfinance institutions, non-bank financial institutions, community financial institutions, smaller institutions that lend to smaller firms, including firms in the informal sector, and therefore have a client base which is exactly the most vulnerable, or at least some of the most vulnerable firms. And if you can't get to those firms, you're not going to save a lot of or most of the jobs that are being lost in this catastrophe, as Otaviano calls it. So I don't know whether hummingbird is the right metaphor for that. I would say it's a more risk-tolerant approach to identifying financial partners. I mean, I think it's going to have to largely be done through banks and financial institutions. The development banks themselves can't go to individual firms and start identifying what's a viable firm and what's not a viable firm. It has to really be through financial institutions, but I'm suggesting it has to be through not the A list of financial institutions, at least exclusively. It also has to be, a much more frontier set of financial institutions. And again, there's a cost to that. The balance sheets of IDB Invest, of IFC, are going to be impacted if they do what I'm suggesting. I think they're trying to do that. I think both the IFC and the IDB Invest have very publicly said we are going to be countercyclical this time. The IDB Invest has said we're going to boost lending from something like 5 billion to, I think, 7 billion. So a very significant increase this year as opposed to retreating at a time of crisis. But most of that is planned for trade finance, not the kind of finance that I'm talking about for small firms, or certainly for small firms in the informal sector. So trade finance is good. Getting trade back going is a good thing to do. And it's also sort of easier for the developing banks themselves. These are short-term credits that are pretty profitable, but it's not the very difficult set of clients, financial institutions and firms that cannot be ignored in this crisis in the region, as well as in the as well as in high-income countries. And high-income countries are having, at least the United States is having trouble with designing programs that reach those kinds of firms, because it doesn't really have the apparatus on the scale that is necessary to finance those firms.
The uncharted territory when the crisis is spread. It's literally global right now, the planetary. We have a few minutes left. Just want to remind, if anyone has a question, to send them now, because we have just a few minutes left. I do want to add a question from a colleague here, Roberto Simon, who asks about the China-U.S. geopolitical dispute in Latin America, where being proxy in several areas, and how does that impact multilaterals in the region, particularly the IDB? Bosco, do you want to take that one?
My pleasure. Well, certainly, I think that in the case of this global dispute, between U.S. and China, Mexico has been one of the greatest winners. As all you know, we have the USMCA now into full effect, and this dispute has allowed for Mexican companies to be able to supply some of the supplies that some Chinese companies were supplying. So we've been able to gain some market share. At the end, I think this is not a positive thing for the region. I think that the best would be to have China and the U.S. on an ideal world collaborating together in favor of the region. I think that both are very important countries, and both countries have interests in the region, and I think that certainly institutions such as the IDB, where you have some very clear rules on how to do these investments, on the tendering processes, having all the social and environment safeguards. It's a great place, for China and the U.S. to collaborate together towards the region. So I think that hopefully these disputes at some stage would be able to water down, and these two great countries will be able to come together and work for the benefit of Latin America. And I think that Latin America shouldn't be choosing of collaborating with China or the U.S. This is not the best solution for anybody.
And Otaviano, quickly before we go, you mentioned at the beginning the ramped up efforts from all these different emergency programs that were set. Which one would you highlight as the most promising for Latin America, if any, or anything that multilaterals can do to think outside the box right now for something that is that can help Latin America go forward sustainably?
Definitely, Cecilia. It will be important to push for and to strengthen the social protection systems in all these countries. If I may, also dovetailing on the issues that Bosco aptly highlighted, there are some things that we can anticipate as likely traits of the post-COVID world. They include, as we said, higher public debt. Okay, this is done. It's going to include as well a high degree of digitalization in the world economy, in world society, and so on. But it will also bring the negative effects with respect to income distribution, income inequality, and poverty. And also that combined with a relative deglobalization and a higher profile assumed by public sectors all over the world to different degrees. The issue will be where a country redefines the line of the strategic sectors, like President Macron in France said one of these days. Now, and this is a paradox because we are at a time when most of the challenges faced by mankind will demand some sort of joint effort. When think about climate change, think about dealing with migration, think about dealing with counterterrorism and you name it, all the major problems faced by mankind in the near future, they need more concerted action by governments. Whereas paradoxically, the crisis has intensified the country level responses, the fight for medicaments, the fight for equipment, and so on. Now, in this regard, I believe that regardless of the result of the US election later this year, the rivalry on technology between the US and China has come to stay. The methods may vary. The time of this rivalry to trade measures in Mr. Trump's style may not be, let's say, may not stay, but that will stay. So the region, Latin America, will be a stage for this kind of exercise for such a rivalry, or whatever be the methods of that. And it's quite important that the countries realize the relevance of keeping their, not doing any sort of straight alignment to any parts of those parts in their rivalry. The gains are little from aligning automatically to any of these giants vis-a-vis the costs. And I think this is a lesson that should be taken seriously by all countries in the region. It comes to my mind the Prime Minister of Singapore recently saying that Singapore, despite its obvious strong ties to China, including in the ethnic side of part of its population, but the Prime Minister declaring, don't ask us to align with any of these giants. We will pursue our interests in a way that does not put us under any kind of this umbrella. I think this is an overall theme that should be considered by all countries in our region.
A quick firing round then before we go. We have just a minute left, so just a quick, very quick. Do you think there will be any changes if we have a Biden government, Nancy? It can be yes or no, if you like.
Yes, I do think so, and because I think it will be an administration fundamentally more inclined to use a multilateral approach to foreign affairs. I would say it would be a time where U.S. leadership would be very much in the spotlight. And so I think a Biden administration would have to rise to that challenge. And the only other thing I would say is that it's also a test of China's leadership during this period, taking Otaviano's point that countries of the region need to chart their own course and sort of navigate between these two giants. But China has become a major official creditor in the world. To certain countries in this region, but certainly in countries in Africa. And this is a test of how responsible a creditor it is during a time when countries are really desperately in need in fiscal resources.
All right, sorry. We are at the minute. So if you, Bosco or Otaviano, want to add anything quickly to that?
Just a silver lining of all this. The silver lining is, I guess, the issues of income inequality and poverty reduction will come to the fore as a result of the pandemics. This is a mix. At least we had such a kind of evolutions in the past, and it's quite important, as Nancy said, that the U.S. stance on world matters switch back to the role as an hegemon, which includes following the rule of law, proposing the rule of law, rather than establishing the law of the jungle, like President Trump did with the partners during his trade wars. Thank you.
All right. So we are pressed for time, so I just want to thank you very, very much, Otaviano Canuto, Nancy Lee, and Bosco Marti. Thank you so much for participating, and thank all of you, of course, for joining us and watching, and to the team that helped make this happen together. I don't do this on my own. There's a lot of people in the background making this happen, so thank you very much to all the team at America Society and Council of the Americas as well. And thank you. Have a good day. Stay safe, everybody. There's a pandemic out there, so take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.